Hello, everyone. This is part one of week 4 of Plato, a class on the Protagoras, Phaedo, and Sophist. We are still talking about the Protagoras, and we now turn to a famous section, which is a kind of long last section of the dialogue. And we see here Socrates and Protagoras discuss decision making and motivational conflict, a phenomenon that they call being overcome by pleasure. And they say that many people say that that is what they experience. They experience these conflicts where they are overcome by pleasure. And they aim to understand that and to get clear about what that means to be overcome by pleasure. The passage is incredibly famous because it seems as if Socrates is endorsing, or at least hypothetically entertaining and adopting for the time being, hedonist premises. But it is not at all taken for granted or at all considered plausible that Socrates is a hedonist or that Plato wants to portray him as a hedonist. So this raises huge questions, and we will spend a couple of recordings just thinking through the various dimensions of this final chunk of the dialogue. For now, I want to pose a question that is fundamental, namely, what is hedonism? When we puzzle, is it even plausible? Is it conceivable that Plato is portraying Socrates as a hedonist? We are kind of presupposing that we have, some kind of notion of what that even is. And once you look a little more closely, you see that that is not at all an easy matter. So my plan for this recording is to dispel what I take to be 3 misunderstandings here, or 3 potential confusions. The first of these is that often it is assumed that Plato must be, deeply and fully against hedonism. Now, that is true insofar as Plato is not a hedonist, but it is not the case that Plato is, as it were, at the end of a spectrum of positions about hedonism. He even says that there are people who are haters of pleasure, and he thinks they are wrong. They are not getting it right, and they don't adequately capture that pleasure is a good thing. Pleasure is one value. Pleasure has positive valence, as we might say. Now, to admit that is not to be a hedonist, but that is an important insight. It is quite plausible, and both Plato and Aristotle think so, that in one way or another, human beings just are motivated by pleasure. And it would be for them not a plausible enterprise to come up with an ethical theory or theory of decision making and motivation, which just says pleasure is a bad thing. Rather, they do acknowledge that pleasure is something that is being pursued and that has, in one way or another, positive valence. And they even think that the life that they think is the best life, a life of virtue or reasoning, is ultimately the most pleasant life. And they take that to be important. So what they end up with when they, portray and analyze, what would it be for a human being to lead a really good life? One dimension of this is that that would be the most pleasant life. So the second misunderstanding that I would like to address is that hedonism is the claim that only pleasure is good. That is not sufficiently precise. It is true that hedonism says that pleasure is the good, so hedonism defends the identification of pleasure and goodness. Pleasure is the good. That is one way to say what hedonism says. However, that does not mean that pleasure is the only good. There could be what we might call derivative goods. For the hedonist, there are going to be a lot of other things that somehow figure in a well-lived life, which are derivatively good on account of their relation to pleasure. So, for example, if it turns out that being virtuous somehow brings pleasure, then virtue can be derivatively good from the point of view of the hedonist. And that means that hedonism is not going to be a one-dimensional, very simplistic kind of theory, or it doesn't have to be. And that is the third misunderstanding that I want to address. There is a kind of commonsensical notion of the hedonist, where that is someone who defends a kind of lowly vision for how one ought to live. And that kind of, we might say, crude hedonism certainly is one kind of hedonism that Plato and Aristotle discussed. Nevertheless, those philosophers in antiquity who actually defend hedonism, in particular then in Hellenistic times, Epicurus, argue for something much more sophisticated. And in a sense, they even agree with a lot of the arguments that Plato explores. Namely, Epicurus is going to argue that the best pleasures, those that we should really pursue and which bring the most long-term pleasure, are those of doing philosophy and spending time with friends. And so there is a way in which that is not too different with respect to the upshot from Plato's view on how one should live. Of course, the arguments that are being put forward in favor of this upshot are very different. But at the end of the day, there is nevertheless the commonality of assuming that really those activities that are going to be the best activities are reasoning and have something to do with having good interactions with other people. Those premises at the beginning of our hedonism passage in the Protagoras, which is around 351 and following, those premises that Socrates and Protagoras seem to accept work towards a kind of clarification of how can we make sense of the idea that on the one hand, pleasure has positive valence, and at the same time, we don't want to be hedonists. At the same time, we want to say, well, there are also bad pleasures, and we are not going to identify pleasure and goodness.